So this is Dr. Todd Shaw's American National Government class, POLI 201 at the University of South Carolina. And this is a lecture being delivered by Dr. Todd Shaw on the topic 3B, voting and political participation. Now remember class, this is part of a section on the practice of American citizenship. And there is likely no more central practice to the status of being a citizen in a society than the ability to vote, particularly if we're talking about a democratic society. So voting is central, in the words of Rosenstone and Hanson on their classic book on voter mobilization, central to the American process. And political participation is an extension upon voting, or let me step back and say political participation is a broad umbrella under which voting as one particular act of citizen participation matters. But there are many, from contacting one's public officials, speaking at public hearings, engaging in peaceful rally and protest, signing petitions. There are a host of ways in which citizens can engage to make those in power in the halls of government aware of their needs and of their interest. So here's my opening story. And this opening story is about you, class. It's about students at the University of South Carolina. In 2014 and or 2012, 2014, 2016, I believe, the National Center for Voting, Learning, and Engagement at Tufts University compiled a fairly extensive set of reports about the voting habits of students, not just across the country as a cross-section, not just college students as an aggregate across the United States in key election years, 2012, 2014. But they compiled individual reports on individual campuses. So the report I'm about to show you, or the small segment of data from the report I'm about to show you, is about the voting behavior of students at the University of South Carolina. If you're a freshman, a first-year student, transfer student, you can say, well, that's not about me. I wasn't here then. But this is to kind of give you a sense of the patterns of student voting at USC, and for us to think about as we go into the 2018 and 2020 election, if you're around, what is occurring at USC and what is mobilizing or not mobilizing students to vote. And I pose this as a question of why do or why don't USC students vote, depending on if you think the glass is half empty or half full. So that 2012 was a presidential election year, as you know, and it was a year when President Barack Obama was running for re-election again as a Democratic candidate, and Governor Mitt Romney, former Governor Mitt Romney of Massachusetts, was running as a Republican candidate for president of the United States. And you'll see that the overall rate, and this is sort of the 2012 voting rate for USC students, rounded up, was about 46%. So 46% of the students who were eligible and registered to vote voted. But if you go down and look a little bit more in terms of the numbers, so what was the rate of registration? 74.3% of USC students had registered to vote by the time of the election. Of the 74.3%, 61.6% of those who were the rate of registered students who actually voted. So from 74 to 71. But the voting rate, the turnout rate, was 45.7%, or again, rounded up to 46%. So now there's 45.7% is the total number of everyone eligible, those who are registered and unregistered. So it looks great. It looks pretty good among registration rates. It looks okay in terms of those who registered to vote, who were registered, but it does not look good as to who voted overall. So less than half of all students who were eligible to vote in this presidential election year actually turned out. Let's look at 2014. 2014 was a midterm election. So 67%, roughly about 67% of students were registered to vote. Then it drops way down to 26.6% of those who were registered to vote actually turned out to vote. And keep in mind, midterm elections are elections where members of Congress are on the ballot, like the 2018 will be the case. But there are a whole host of other elections that could go on in a midterm election, like a gubernatorial election, a governor election, or election for members of the state legislature or members of the school board or city councils. So there's a whole host of elections that occur at the same time, not just members of Congress, though they're of course important. But here's the voting base, and it's a dreary 17.8%. So of everybody who might have been eligible to vote had they registered, only 17.8% of those students turned out to vote. Now, I'm not berating USC students because, quite frankly, the USC story parallels the story found across other campuses and across the nation. But let's do a little more digging before we end this story. So what of the comparisons between, let's just take one of many we could make, between undergraduates and graduate students? Well, the rates are not fantastic still, but graduate students, being a little older, having naturally a little bit more education, were more likely to turn out in 2012. So they had a 49% rate of turnout, roughly half, as compared to 41.9% for undergraduates. So this is breaking the entire student body down. That's why these numbers are different from the previous numbers. That rate was even larger in 2014. So 28.4% of graduate students turned out to vote at USC, as compared to 13.4% of undergraduates. Really dreary rates still, but even drearier when you make this comparison. And I know I'm making a value judgment and calling them dreary, but they are kind of low, aren't they? That's nothing to tout about, but this is an American story, not just a USC story of really why don't Americans vote, as Piven and Clark asked in their book many years ago. Why don't we vote is really the question. Now let's compare USC to other campuses across the nation. And here you can kind of see that though our rates are lower, the voting rates for the USC students are lower overall, they're not dramatically lower. So here's our institution. Here's USC, around 46%. That's close to only about a one or no more than 2-point difference for all institutions. So we're kind of on par, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it. Among research institutions that are known as Carnegie One research institutions, those institutions with the largest endowments, those institutions with very high research reputations, 47% or 48%, 48% among public institutions, which would be us. So we are a public research institution. So that's a little bit broader gap. Among private research institutions, we're a little closer because they're a little lower. Similar numbers from 2014 as to 2012. We're on par, fortunately or unfortunately. So we'll unpack this story in class when we come to our course discussion class. But why do or why don't USC students vote? Really, it's a story of why do or why don't Americans vote overall. So when we talk about voting and participation, let's talk about who votes. Let's discuss why don't we vote, because that seems to be part of the question. And you might say, well, 60% registration or 70% registration, how do you look at it? That's pretty good. Yeah, but who actually turns out once they are registered to vote? And then what are the costs of participation? I want to look at this from a a principles of politics standpoint. And here are the principles of politics we want to discuss. So I'm inserting these principles that you won't find directly correlate with chapter 11 of your textbook, but I'm kind of breaking chapter 11 down a bit more. I'm talking in this lecture about individual voting and the rationales for voting, which your authors do discuss in chapter 11. But I'm breaking it down even further to say, well, let's first talk about the practice of citizenship for voting, and then we'll talk about campaigns and elections. So the rationality principle matters here, in my view. Individuals may see non-voting as being in their rational self-interest. Well, why should I vote? My vote is only one of, in a city election. My vote is only one of possibly 10,000 votes. How will my one vote matter? Well, there are close distances, there are close and competitive elections all across the United States. Maybe there is a reason why your vote matters. Maybe your vote does matter. And I'm going to try not to be editorial in this particular lecture class, but I do take the stance that voting matters. I will at least share with you that particular viewpoint, that I do believe voting matters. But there is a sort of complicated free rider problem that occurs if one doesn't vote. So remember, the free rider problem says that, well, of a public good, or a public good is something that everyone can share, whether they've contributed or not contributed. It's something that they share. So we all have the outcomes of government one way or another. But it's not exactly whether you vote or don't vote. You still have the benefits or the outcomes of laws that are passed. You still ride the street. You still travel the streets by way of car. You still have electricity, by virtue of the utilities provided. I mean, there's a range of things that occur. Maybe that electricity is not a great example, but there's a range of things that occur whether you vote or don't vote, as being virtue of you just being a citizen. But it's a complicated free rider problem, right? And let's think about the complications of that free rider problem when you don't vote. In fact, I'm going to leave that part for our discussion. Then the history principle. Our patterns of non-voting in the U.S. are shaped in part by previous trends, but we have a complicated turnout puzzle that defies previous trends. So history doesn't exactly explain, although it does partly explain why we do why we vote or don't vote, and I'll unpack that. And then there's a new principle I want to introduce. It's called the social capital principle, and there are a number of political scientists, or those who've contributed to political scientists, like Nobel Prize winner Elinor Ostrom, or very well-known political scientist Robert Putnam, who have all thought about this social capital issue. And actually, I have to be honest, I think about social capital in my own research. It's a question I kind of unpack in my own research on neighborhood and community voting. But it's the idea that people collectively act together because of their social connections to each other. There's a reason why I join a club, why I engage in civic life, why I might participate in a voter mobilization drive. It has something to do with my connections to others and my connections to groups that matter to me. So, and these connections are in part built on the trust one has, the reputation one has, and the reciprocity or mutual exchange you have with others. And this comes directly from the thinking of Elinor Ostrom in terms of face-to-face contact and social connections matter. But I will unpack that toward the end of the lecture when I talk about the cost of participation. Okay, let's talk about voting. Voting gives the mass public periodic input into the processes of government. It is so central of a process, of course, that the framers had to decide first and foremost whether it would find its way or wouldn't find its way as a guarantee in the Constitution of the United States. Of course, you and I both know, and I'm not saying this to be derisive, but they kind of punted on the question. They kind of said, well, or let me be objective and say that what they did was say, in fact, we will give this whole notion of the suffrage or franchise to the states for them to decide who will vote. So that was a part of a federal compromise. But it is an ongoing set of questions about who's entitled to vote, who has a right to vote, and of course in a democratic society, how voting matters. And until the 1960s and federal intervention, states used their discretion to deny the vote to various categories of adults. We certainly have in our civil rights section, we've talked about the denial of the right to vote to African Americans. It could be extended to Latinos in southwestern states. But there were a host of other considerations. Of course, the consideration of age, the consideration of gender, were women permitted the right to vote. So there, and today, one who has a felony conviction still has ways in which the state has a direct bearing upon whether you can or cannot vote in a given instance, particularly in some of the southern states, but it's true across the United States. So there are still categories that the states decide whether or not one in this particular state, if you can or cannot vote based on a particular status. Now, there is a puzzle that we're going to talk about throughout this lecture, and the puzzle is that voter turnout should have increased, but generally has not. Now, here's the interesting twist on this puzzle. It was true up until the 2000s that generally it has not, but we've seen somewhat of an uptick in voter mobilization and voter turnout in the early 21st century. So the puzzle's not quite the puzzle it used to be, but it is still a bit of a puzzle if you put this in comparison to, if we think about it and put it in comparison to other democracies or Western democracies across the world. All right, so all political participation has cost. Here I'm showing you the wide range of ways in which participation matters. Now, when I say participation, often in this lecture, I'm talking about conventional participation, but there's unconventional participation, or there's participation that's beyond sort of simply following the means as provided by law. There's civil disobedience and protest. One might argue that even violent protest is a form of participation. That's a broader question to tackle. And I am showing you here sort of a historic protest and police engagement on Kent State in Kent State University in Kent, Ohio in the 1970s around the Vietnam War that turned violent and police fired upon students, killing a handful of students. And so there is ways in which this is certainly raising one's voice, engaging in the process. But there's a cost, of course. There's a clear cost to protest of that nature. It's a matter of life and death in that particular instance. When we look at the sort of empty voting booth, what are the costs that you bear in having to go out to vote? Taking time off one's job, figuring out where you're registered, registering. There's a whole host of costs that you still bear in that instance, though they may not be an immediate life and death set of cost. Voting can be the easiest form of participation, but turnout fell dramatically and since the 1960s has only recovered some. So we might say, well, of all these ranges of things one could do that has a great impact, voting is a fairly regularized process. But why hasn't it been maintained, or why have we seen sort of drops in turnout in voting since the 1960s? What are the costs? Are there new costs that people are bearing, or what's occurring here? What's the puzzle? An American turnout is much lower than turnout in other democracies. Now, we talked about this, Jan. We've talked about this in previous lectures, and I'm going to show you these rates again with regards to other democracies, placing the United States in comparison to other Western democracies, and in what way our rates are lower, clearly lower than other democratic Western countries. Jan. Okay, so this is a point conveyed in the previous lecture, but even more discouraging because it's the percentage of voting age population who turn out to vote. So this rate is what I'm showing you in this graphic it differs from what I showed you in a previous lecture, because this is the actual turnout across the entire population of all those persons eligible. What's the turnout overall? And so this is the voting age population says, those who are 18 and older, according to voting laws, who in fact turned out, who registered, got it together and turned out. So here's Australia at the very top at 78.8%. Here's the United States at the bottom at 53.3%. Now we may not be at the bottom of all lists if you include a larger number of countries. We may not be at the very bottom, but we still do have some lower rates. You have countries like Thailand and South Africa. South Africa being more democratic than Thailand. But you also see France in here, right? France in 2016 had a lower rate turnout. So are there some comparisons as to what's true in the United States, South Africa, and Thailand? A question for comparative politics to ask. Are there things going on similarly in these countries than would be true in Australia, Brazil, Sweden, and Canada in the United Kingdom? So what are the differences as to why in these democratic or fairly democratic countries you have differing rates of turnout? One answer might be that it's interesting that in some respects the U.S. gets higher marks across a range of scores when you say, okay, well, how do you unpack the reasons why Americans vote or don't vote? You could take a whole range of scores as to what do Americans do and what characteristics we have, and we score pretty high on these characteristics. So I think this comes from mid-1990s data, data looking across a pattern of statistics among democratic countries. And so if you look at the question of how close are you to the party, what's your level of efficacy? In other words, how effective do you think your own participation is? How much does your participation matter? Do you have interest relative to the elections going on? Do you try to persuade others? Do you work with a political party? How highly educated is the nation? To what percentage is a white collar workers, a middle class? All of these are which should be indicators of high turnout. And when you compare these to 7 other democracies, we do score well and higher. But somehow the U.S. still has a lower rate of turnout in comparison. And I know this is not exactly an apples to apples comparison because you need to know what these countries are. But it is intriguing that there are ways in which the United States is a very affluent country, is a country where there are lots of incentives to turn out to vote, and yet we don't. And we will talk about the barriers to voting in the United States. And I don't mean barriers simply in the sense that there are literally barricades, but what do we do here that may, in unconscious or implicit ways, discourage people from voting? Although let me also say the bottom line that all of us as citizens have individual responsibility for voting. So both of those propositions are true. Okay, let's do a little bit more unpacking as to who votes, or in this case, who voted. How has the American electorate changed? And your authors give you this, what I think is a pretty intriguing graphic about the growth of the American, the growth of the American electorate since 1790, the beginning of the country. And this goes from 1790, the literal first election of the United States, to 2016, the most recent election in the United States. So in 1824, with the rise of Jacksonian democracy, popular elections for the president replaced state legislatures selecting electoral college delegates. And so you began to see rates which increase the overall voter turnout or the eligible number of voters. And this is the percent of the population eligible to vote in national elections and percentage of the population that did vote in national elections. So you see in some ways that this green bar and this blue bar, there was a dramatic uptick in the blue bar, and it was not that far from the green bar, from the green area. So there was sort of some close parallels. The passage of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution guaranteed the right to vote for all races and for ex-slaves. The percentage of the population who could vote ticked up a bit here. You see the bar becomes a little higher there along this axis. And turnout itself also increased. But the 19th Amendment doubled the eligible electorate by granting all adult women the right to vote. Shot up. Well, why did it shoot up? Well, because you increased the percentage of the folk who could vote by 100%, or you increased it. You essentially double the number of people who had the right to vote, because women comprise half to more than half of the country, and more than half of the electorate. So this green bar got really steep, right? Really steep. And you can see that so did the blue bar, but the distance in between them increased. The 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18, shot up even more. But again, what you see here is an interesting, what I call the two plateaus of political participation, the two plateaus of voter turnout. Really steep, a fairly shallow incline here, and a really steep incline here with real distance in between the two. Okay, so that's sort of the history principle in effect, right? Let's go even further. Let's look at it from just the standpoint of turnout. And this graphic from your authors is from 1864 to 2020 years in terms of elections. So these are the election years, and this is the percentage of people who turned out to vote. So you had in 1864 or 1862, around thereabouts, you had somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 to about 74% of the population who were eligible to vote turning out to vote. But if you come all the way to 2020, or 2016, pardon me, 2016, you had roughly a little more than 60% of the folk. So you've had some decline over the broad sweep from 1864 to 2016. Some clear decline, right? But let's talk about the nature of that decline. And we're going to basically go back over that history just a little bit. When I discuss sort of the two plateaus of turnout, you have one plateau here, and again, it was portrayed nicely in the previous graphic. The plateau of essentially the 19th century, where you had Jacksonian democracy turning people out to vote in large numbers. You had a real sort of mass politics occur, as we'll talk about in campaigns, elections, but we'll also talk about with presidential parties. Parties were mobilizing people at high levels. There were new voters entering into the system, whether it be African Americans by way of the 15th Amendment, or high mobilization of new immigrants who were coming to the country, the Irish, the Germans, Italians, more toward the end of the century. So you have these new immigrants coming in, being mobilized at high levels, parties mobilizing at high levels, and the eligibility and the percentage who were eligible to vote was a smaller percentage. So it was easier to mobilize a high number of fewer eligible, of a smaller eligible base, high levels of mobilization. But then you come to the 20th century, and that plateau is clear. It's a second plateau, and there's a clear drop off between the two, right? So let's talk about what your authors didn't discuss is sort of the electoral reforms, or what they didn't show in that graphic, but they discuss in the book, are certain electoral reforms that occurred, certain reforms with regards to who can vote and how we vote. The progressive reforms of the late 1890s into the early 20th century, the progressive reform says we're going to get corruption out of politics, where political machines and political parties are corrupt, run by political bosses trying to mobilize immigrants and the working class. We're going to clean them up. So the Australian ballot, the reform of voting, that you couldn't go into a voting booth with someone else and have them mark your ballot, particularly if you had some levels of illiteracy, you could not read, you had to mark your own ballot. So the private Australian ballot. But registration was another clear reform that also had a depressing effect. Even though it was a reform to clean up politics, it had a depressing effect on turnout. So registration is a process. Yet you had to register before you vote. That's a step you had to take before you went to the voting booth. That had some depressing effects. So some of these reforms, though important, also you witness a decline, and the fact that you increase the pool overall. So we can see even before women had the right to vote, these numbers were coming down. These numbers were coming down also because of non-electoral reforms, such as the disenfranchisement of African Americans after the Reconstruction period. That's just one other sort of reason why you saw these reforms decline along, or the rates decline along with the electoral reforms. But women having the right to vote then increased the pool, so you begin to see an upward tick again. But when you think about what occurred in the 1960s forward, why did we see this drop off? Although there's been some recovery. Why this valley, even though we again have seen some recovery? So here's where I didn't talk about this prior to, with regards to our discussion when I looked at student voter rates, but this is a really important point. There is always what we as political scientists call roll-off in national elections. Presidential elections always witness greater levels of turnout, higher rates of turnout as compared to midterm elections. People just pay more attention when someone is running for president of the United States than they do when someone's running as a member of Congress or running for a seat in Congress, to become a member of the House of Representatives or to be a U.S. Senator. They just do. And so that degree of, there's a higher level of mobilization, there's a higher level of media attention, there's a whole host of things that draw people in and that people care about, because we pay a lot of attention, of course, to who's elected president of the United States. We don't often know who our member of Congress is, or many people don't know who their member of Congress is. Or something. Let me be fair. A significant number of people don't know who their member of Congress is, and they certainly don't know who their member of the state legislature is. So we see, and even though that we've seen these checkered patterns since 1932 in terms of turnout, this green bar is always higher than this red bar. The years in which you had a presidential election, and its turnout rate is always higher than the election for members of the House. And this is just midterm House elections. It didn't include senatorial elections, but it's a similar pattern as well. So who votes? And I have a little, cartoon, and it's probably a little dated given my popular cultural reference, but how to increase voter turnout. So you put the following options on the ballot. Vote for president, vote for Congress, vote for American Idol. Okay. Again, that's a little dated reference, but be that as it may, the turnout puzzle, let's come back to it. The turnout puzzle is that although the system is more open than in previous decades and demographic traits have improved, turnout worsened. In other words, there are all these ways in which we should have seen turnout remain high or even increase. You had an expansion, in the 20th century to mid 20th century. You had the expansion in terms of the right of women to vote. You had the increasing observance and enforcement of African Americans and other ethnic minorities to vote. You gave the young people the right to vote. So, those expansions of the system, those expansions of the eligible voter base, along with the fact that we over the last 40 years, we've become slightly more educated. We've become a little better, a little more, have seen some relative increase in the economic well-being of Americans. All those things would suggest positively, this would give greater incentive for people to vote. Think back to that graphic where I showed all of the ways in which Americans are a little bit more affluent than as compared to folks in other Western democracies. We are an affluent country, and in many respects. Now, one signal we might think about is the fact that Americans aren't making as much as they want to make. They aren't experiencing the same level of economic prosperity that they hope. That income levels have not really changed in the last 40 years, and we haven't really seen great increases in the economic well-being of Americans. Maybe that's a puzzle to unpack as to why people are discouraged from voting. That's one of many, but just thinking through this puzzle is important. So the problem is difficult to study. It's not exactly straightforward in some ways because there's an over-reporting problem, right? There are characteristics that make one more likely to vote. Socioeconomic status matters. Age matters. Ethnicity matters. So let me unpack a concept called social desirability. Social desirability is simply the concept where when asked a question, when you're asked a question like, did you vote? Even if you didn't, you're more likely to say you did than you did not. Why? Because it's a socially desirable behavior. You feel a degree of social or political pressure to say, yes, I'm a citizen. Of course I voted, even if you didn't. So social desirability is the pressure individuals feel to, in fact, report behavior that they think is congruent or socially desirable in the society. Let me show you some concrete numbers. And this is looking at turnout rates between 1944 and 2008. And now there are three lines here. You have this dark line, this black line at the top, this yellow line in the middle, and the green line at the bottom. What are they measuring? So from 1944 or 1948 roughly, when the American National Election Study, the ANES, which is sort of the premier study on voting in the United States over the last 50, 60 years. So in 1948, the percentage of people who say they voted was roughly below 65%. The voting age population, okay, so this is, I'm sorry, let me explain. ANES is the American National Election Study. The CPS is the Census Population Study. So the census verifies through actual numbers and turnout who does actually vote, or they make a calculation of what the turnout rate would have been. Don't get completely confused by the voting age or the VEP calculation, but it is important to look at the ANES and the CPS and also sort of take into account the VEP. So each of these are making different calculations. But if you look at these two top lines, looking at the two top lines, the ANES number is always higher, the line is higher than the census number. In other words, more people said they voted because the ANES, the American National Election Study, is a survey that asks people whether they voted or not, among many other political questions. Where the CPS goes out, looks at the numbers, and sees, based upon the voting age population and reported numbers at various precincts within various states and districts, who actually seem to have turned out. So this is a social desirability effect. There's one example of it, of that more people voted, more people said they voted than actually voted. And these lines are pretty consistent. And in fact, you can see that they parallel each other in many respects, right? Okay. So In comparison, so who votes? What are the demographic characteristics that would indicate that one votes? So there are various social demographic or socioeconomic characteristics that you can guess at, right? Based on from previous discussion or just your own understanding of how things work politically. So we would expect those with higher incomes, and this is 2012, the 2012 election, in terms of voter registration rates by demographic. So, and even though I say more likely to turn out, you can't turn out if you don't register, right? If you don't register to vote, you can't vote. So who's more likely to vote based upon who is registered is really what I'm showing you here. So if you look across the income characteristics, family income characteristics, there is a straight relationship between those who make, less than 20,000, and as you go on up to those who make over 100,000. At each rate of income, there's a higher percentage of people who are registered to vote. So the more, the higher your family income, the more likely you are to register to vote. By college education, same relationship from high school education to college graduate. There is a pretty steep increase at each level of education. The employed are more likely to vote than the unemployed. And so these are the sort of the socioeconomic characteristic, the economic characteristics that matter. Let's look at some other demographic characteristics. I'm going to jump down to age and then back up to ethnicity. By age, yes, the older one is, the more likely one is to vote. There's, again, a pretty straight line monotonic relationship at each level of age. One characteristic and I point this out because it speaks to, again, our previous section on civil rights, that in 2012, the 2012 election, the rates of voter registration were roughly equal between whites and their African-American counterparts by the data we were able to collect from the U.S. Census Bureau. Groups that were less likely, but still on parallel with each other to vote, were Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans. But those two groups are in parallel to each other. And these are among the main census category groups with regards to race and ethnicity in the United States. So there's many ways in which ethnicity and race mattered to a degree, but there are some parallels between groups as to who was registered to vote registered to vote in pretty similar rates across these group categories. All right, so low turnout is probably caused by several related factors. Maybe there are some structural factors that matter. And I'm showing you here a picture of President Clinton signing the motor voter bill, an attempt to ensure that everyone who gets a driver's license also has access to registering to vote. But registering to vote and actually turning out is another matter. And here I'm showing you former North Carolina Republican Senator Jesse Helms at a campaign rally. And so who actually turns out to vote to support their candidates is a difference between, there's a difference between who registered and who turns out, right? Are there some structural factors, right? So barriers to voting. In the United States, the process of voter registration is a complicated one, and it's only becoming more complicated. So the fact that you ask people to register prior to voting, even though one can argue that that's a check on political fraud that brings about some clarity as to the voting base. You can verify things more easily when you have people pre-registered to vote. That also is a barrier. That we greatly vary from state to state as to when you register to vote, how many days you have in terms of a deadline prior to registering to vote. We can vary pretty greatly in terms of when you show up to the polls, what form of identification, from no voter identification to pretty standard forms of voter identification. So that the voter ID may matter in that respect. And there's some indication from the work of Zoltan Hajnal that there is some slight depressing effect, even though there's an argument to be made on the other side about, yes, but does it decrease fraud? These are ongoing sort of debates. But registration might be one reason why there's a sort of structural barrier to greater turnout. However, that doesn't kind of explain the 1960s, right? Or not completely. And so we have to think this through, because we've been registering folk to vote since the turn of the century. So does that really explain the turnout puzzle? Maybe, maybe not. Weak party systems. So we have as I'm going to talk about in the section on elections, but even more directly, the section on political parties, we have a weak party system. By that I mean that candidates really are at the center of our party system. In other words, if you choose to run as a member, as a nominee for a particular seat or particular office as a Republican candidate or a Democratic candidate or a Libertarian candidate, in most cases, you simply just say, I want to run for this nomination. The party doesn't sit down and interview you, as might be true in a strong parliamentary system. The party doesn't sit down and say, okay, you have the right to vote now, or we're going to select you as a candidate to run in our party. No, you select the party doesn't select you. And so in some ways, because we have such a candidate-centered system, there is great competition. That's a great thing. But that competition means that the party has very little say, or only some degree of say. Let me be more objective here. Some degree of say as to who is its actual candidates. And so how it chooses to mobilize, if it chooses to mobilize, that's a whole host of considerations. So that weak party system also means, as we'll see, that people aren't as strongly attached to political parties in the United States as may be true elsewhere. We have a large segment of folk who claim they are independent. In fact, you can divide it evenly a third Republican, a third independent, a third Democrat. So in all of these ways, we don't have as strong of attachment to parties, and thus parties in the 20th and 21st century may not mobilize people in the same way they did in the 19th century, or have the ability to mobilize and get people out to vote in the same sense. Then there are individual factors. So we can talk about the structural factors, but what are the individual factors? Well, one might be weak efficacy. So we have seen some declines, even though I showed you those high numbers. We have seen some declines in efficacy and other things such as trust in the political system. Do people simply say it doesn't matter like it used to, or it doesn't matter at all? Maybe people's sense of efficacy is increasing. Maybe it's not. Maybe the sense of efficacy is increasing, which might suggest why there are higher rates of turnout. Maybe it's the contentiousness of our election. Maybe it's the ways in which people are mobilized by certain candidates. All these things could matter as to why individuals may or may not feel more effective or think that their vote matters. That's what efficacy means. And weak party system, weak party attachment, as I said earlier. And so whether or not, I might claim myself nominally as a Democrat in West Virginia, but that doesn't mean I don't vote for across the party lines and for Republicans in several instances. So, the idea that one votes a straight ticket because you have this attachment to your party, there's a lot of crossover voting that happens in American elections, particularly American presidential elections, even as divided and polarized as they have become, or as they've remained. Let me be historical. American elections have always been contentious, and that's some degree of comfort maybe we can take in that polarization is not a new thing. But again, you still have some significant crossover voting because people aren't as attached to political parties in our system as may be true elsewhere. Okay, so let's be real. Can democracy work with low turnout? Can we really say that, well, although we only have maybe half of the electorate showing up in a national election, the eligible electorate showing up in a national election, maybe only less than 50% of USC students are voting who could vote. That doesn't mean we're not still a democratic country and things aren't going quite well. And people are voting because they think they want to express an opinion. and they have their freedom of speech. And if you don't vote, you might be voting, you might be given an opinion in a tacit way of saying it doesn't matter. Or I really don't have the time. It's not worth it. So maybe we're being democratic as to who shows up and who doesn't show up. Okay, that's possible. And commentator George Will has made a very eloquent set of discussions about why, in fact, you can say that we still get a pretty representative government even with our low rates of turnout. If your answer is yes, then you may say voters may be content. Now, content broadly construed, right? They may say, well, my non-vote means everything's okay, or my non-vote means it doesn't matter. We can take content in different ways. If you answer no, it can only mean that those who vote have a voice. If you don't vote, if you don't get out to vote, here's the free rider problem, right? You don't necessarily have the ability to give input. And there is the rub, the difficulty we face here. Is there such thing as an informed non-voter? I know just how corrupt the system is, and I'm not engaging in it. So is those who have greater political knowledge, are they more likely to vote or no more likely to vote than other folks? There are other factors other than I understand what's going on and I want to make a difference, or I understand what's going on and I'm not going to put my name down as consigning to all that corruption. Anyway, I'm being a little apocryphal, but I want to stress to you the point that can we say that democracy works with low turnout? So let's get further down the road and think about the individual or group, or some might say sociological factors that matter. Let's think broadly about political participation. Political participation entails those conventional and unconventional actions citizens take to affect governmental and community outcomes. Okay? So given that definition, there's a range of measures that political scientists use to gauge political participation. From voting to, do you contribute to campaigns? Do you work in campaigns? Do you give money to candidates? Do you discuss politics? Have you contacted public officials about some concern? Do you sign a petition? Do you gather together to discuss issues that matter with people in a neighborhood association or group or civic group? There's all the ranges of things one could do that you might call political participation. And those are the measures we use on surveys to say whether or not people are engaging or not engaging in conventional things that fall within the realm of things people typically do, or unconventional things that people don't typically do. People don't typically protest. We don't show up to a protest every day. That's a more unconventional form of action, although it certainly may move those in government, and people who do it may feel that it matters. But conventional and unconventional actions are what are entailed in political participation. So remember, all political participation has a cost. By cost, we mean being a rational self-actor. What's the cost benefit of what's happening, or what's the cost benefit to me of doing this action? For you to go register to vote, go find your polling place, figure out how to get to your polling place, be informed about the candidates, go vote for a candidate, put the little sticker on, walk out. All of those things are things you have to do consciously. No one makes you in the United States do these things. And in fact, this may be a part of, and I forgot to mention this, but the fact that in some systems, in some democratic systems, there is compulsory voting, that you are required to vote or you are taxed. We don't tax people for not voting in the United States. Some might argue we should, but we haven't come to that point in our political thinking, in our political culture. And so that might be a cost imposed on the front end, but there are more tacit costs that are imposed on the back end for Americans in taking on any range of political forms of participation. And the more resources you have, the more likely you are to participate. Well, the reason why people who have more income are more likely to vote one's socioeconomic status does have a bearing on your political knowledge, how much you're engaged, and how efficacious you might feel about politics. But you have a car. You can hop in your car. You probably may have a nice car. Fill it up with gas. You have internet connectivity, so you can find out where your polling place is. You can look up your registration. You have resources you can use to engage. Whereas if I'm working class or poor, do I have to figure out the bus route? Do I have to figure out how to take time off from my job? I don't have flexibility in my job. I got to go to the public library to find, where I'm registered to vote. So imagine sort of the differences that people have when they have different resources to use to politically participate or politically engage. Just as certain examples. So what is the context of participation? So I want to take it a step further and talk about the ways in which we engage in protest because we engage in groups. People are more likely to participate when they're mobilized or actively encouraged to participate. This comes from the research of Rosenstone and Hansen, among many others. Why do people participate? Why do people vote? Because others ask them to. They talk with others. Candidates reach out to them. But they may have circles of friends and family and members of their church who say, aren't you registered to vote? Aren't you going to turn out for this election? People engage, people participate. They may be on Facebook or be in social media, and that's a way in which others reach out to them. But people engage and participate because they're asked to do so. That's a simple lesson about political mobilization. It is sort of the group context, thus, that is most likely to mobilize people to participate. Participation, we might think of it as individual traits that people have, but they engage in participation because they're in groups. So participation, though you go vote in an individual voting booth, you may be mobilized by groups to take that individual act. So think of a couple examples true for students. You belong to you're a member of a sorority or fraternity, and they have a voter registration drive. So because of your connections to that group, you engage and you encourage others to engage and participate. There might be a ballot issue discussed at a parish, a synagogue, or a mosque to which you belong. So because you belong to a parish and you're a priest, after the worship service or at a setting on a Saturday, invites someone in to talk about a particular important issue. And even though the churches are very careful and have to be very careful about endorsing political candidates, churches have free speech rights to talk about issues. They can't tell you what to vote, who to vote for, but they can say what a group as a religious body may support as a broader policy issue. So you sit down, you attend that particular information session, and you're mobilized and engaged to get involved or to take a certain action. Or a candidate debate sponsored by the college Republicans. We were talking about engaging in a candidate forum or a party forum as part of an extra credit exercise. But these types of forums then get people engaged. They get them mobilized. The group context matters. So let's revisit social capital. So if we're talking about groups, we're talking about connections. And so social capital, just to refresh your memory and to give you sort of yet another slice at this definition, is those relationships that enable persons to act together more effectively to pursue shared goals. So in social capital, and I'm showing a little dollar sign with people engaged there. Social capital, capital is our resources. Capital are resources. And so social capital is sort of a relational resource. I get engaged because I trust my best friend when she sends me information by way of a Facebook post. That's a relationship that got me engaged. I believe in the reputation of this person who's the president of my club or the priest of my parish. So I get engaged because of their reputation, because they have high standing. I get engaged because I think if I do this for my friend, reciprocity, or for my mom, So my mom has done great things for me. I'm going to do it. And my mom says, I should go out to vote. Okay, I love my mom. I'm going to go out to vote. So all of these ways in which we engage are these relationships that encourage us to actively work. And let me say, not just at the individual level. I'm sorry. Let me stress this: to work together, to collectively work together, not just on an individual basis, but in my neighborhood, in my civic group, I work with these people because of the relationships I have. And that working together might be civic engagement, people's connection with the life of their community, the ways in which they engage in these activities that connect them to the life of the community. Okay. Now, there's then the phenomenon and the award-winning book by Robert Putnam that talks about the problem of bowling alone. So, when you bowl, it's fun. It's more fun, I think. It's just me, but it's more fun to bowl with someone else, to be in competition with a friend or family member, or with a group of friends or family members. To do that as a group activity than to sit there by yourself and bowl. You might be practicing, but to really kind of have a spirit of competition and fun, it's important. It's an activity that is fun together. And so Putnam comes up with this idea of bowling alone. People who are not engaged, they do these activities by themselves. And they're less likely to do them because they're not doing them in the context of a group, because they're not being mobilized in a group to work collectively with the group. So that's Putnam's idea of bowling alone. Now, having said that, then are there some possible puzzles as to why people have not turned out in previous elections, or why turnout is still relatively low, even though it is increasing? And so we have not only a turnout puzzle, but a real mystery as to why people are joining fewer and fewer groups. And this is the other consideration that Putnam found in his book, that across a range of ways, particularly among the younger generation, that we are a bit less engaged as compared to generations of 30 years ago. Joining fewer groups, engaging in fewer bowling clubs. We're not joining church and religious organizations. And attending church in levels that was true 30, 40 years ago. So all of this, these be culprits as to why we are not turning out? Well, is one culprit of the reason we're joining fewer groups, thus being mobilized less, is we are too busy and we have no money. Is it that people have busier lives? Well, maybe there's some evidence that we are working more hours, and there have been slight upticks in American productivity. But is that really the culprit, that we don't have enough time to engage? Certainly people are working more in certain senses, and working hours are varying. But do we have no time that we engage? People spend certainly a lot of time in social media, and that is a form of group engagement, if you will. So is that really the reason? Is it marital and family ties? We're getting married less. People are having fewer children. And that particular context where if you were a parent, you would join the PTA, you would engage with your child's school. There's a range of things you do as a parent, being engaged in soccer clubs or cheerleading teams. All of these things that parents do to be engaged. And when they go and they take their child, they engage with other parents. And then they have discussions and conversations that might be meaningful ways in which that leads to civic engagement. So is our decline in marital rates and our sort of fewer our rates in terms of the number of children that people are having, that have any bearing upon the ways in which we're less connected to groups? Are we less connected to groups because we move around more? We're more mobile. We don't stay in the same place, and we literally hop in our car to drive various places as opposed to be engaged in our neighborhood. Is that a culprit? There's another culprit, the younger generation. The younger generation, the millennials, the X, I forget exactly what generation you are now. But, you know, the millennial generation, just as an example, is less engaged. Well, there's actually some evidence that that's not completely true, that the millennial generation thinks about volunteerism in pretty good numbers, that it matters to this younger generation, to your generation, about being engaged on some level. So it's not completely true that you're wholly disconnected to groups. The question is, what groups are you engaging in when you join groups? Well, Putnam gave an answer that really what he thought might be the culprit is television. Entertainment, individual forms of media. And Putnam wrote this in the 1990s, so we could update it to say, you know, you sitting at your computer and streaming, you sitting in front of your device and engaging in entertainment that takes you away, that you, when you come home in the evening, you put your feet up on the sofa, you grab a beer. Well, excuse me, I'm sorry. Let me not say that to you. But you grab a drink and you sit down, you watch several hours of TV. You know, whether you're on your device streaming or playing video games, there's just a range of ways Putnam says we're literally tuning out and we're not engaging. Well, I'm going to stop the lecture here because I'm going to leave us with this puzzle. But I'm going to have, we'll have a discussion at the end if in fact Putnam's conclusions are true. And I would argue that no, they're not completely true, but there are ways in which Putnam gives us some interesting clues as to why people aren't engaging in groups in quite the same at quite the same level. We'll unpack that, and then to what degree this lack of civic engagement leads to a lack of political participation on other levels. Anyway, class, this has been Dr. Todd Shaw at the University of South Carolina in the Department of Political Science with American National Election Government class POLI 201 on political participation, topic 3B, all rights reserved of this intellectual property of Dr. Todd Shaw. Thank you much.